The American Academy of Pediatrics has issued updated safety recommendations for home births. It says, quote, hospitals and accredited birth centers remain the safest settings for births in the U.S., even amid the coronavirus pandemic. Still, though, midwives say they are seeing a surge in expectant mothers interested in home births to avoid hospitals during this pandemic. Two of those mothers shared their stories with us.
I felt so torn, and I just felt like my birth plan was just ripped out right from underneath me, and I was so pregnant and nervous, but also just wondering what we were going to do and trying to just find new options very quickly.
Labor presents so many unknowns, and we have a huge, like a bigger unknown kind of on top of that. I don't know if I've been able to process any of it.
This has been a really stressful time for everybody. We're in a space of just practicing in a way that is not typical for us.
As we were hearing things about hospital policy changes and all of that stuff, we started looking into home birth a little bit more. I needed my husband and my doula for birth support in order to have the natural hospital birth that I was hoping for. And as coronavirus really started to kind of unravel, that's when our plans started to change. I would say around 39 weeks pregnant, which some women have had their baby by then. My doula came to me and said that I just want to let you know that our hospital here has decided to only allow one support partner, and that means I cannot attend your birth. And that was just a knife to my heart.
I've been practicing midwifery for about 15 years. I've done both home births and attending births in freestanding birth centers. In the last month or so, we've about doubled our client load for those who are planning to give birth in the next 6 weeks or so. Some of the people that are calling us to switch their care from the hospital are due to a concern of being exposed to COVID-19 while in the hospital.
It's been sort of multi-levels of risk assessment. Where am I going to be the safest? And when it wasn't in a pandemic, the safest place felt like a hospital with a midwifery practice. All of a sudden, we have a pandemic situation, and the hospital we were going to be delivering at is one of the first drive-through COVID testing sites that get set up in Western Washington. So that becomes a higher risk place for me to walk into. We had to transfer midwifery care pretty late in the game, actually. Like, you don't really want to be switching care providers in your third trimester if you can help it.
We've had to make a number of changes in the way that we provide care. For prenatal care, we've moved a number of our visits to telehealth.
So I've had 2 virtual visits now. I just had my second in-person visit, and I'm at a point now where typically you would be going in every week for the last 4 weeks of your pregnancy. I will only see my midwives probably once or twice more in person before the baby actually comes.
The midwives are all wearing cloth masks during our prenatal visits and gloves, even just to take a person's blood pressure.
People have a mask on. I don't actually know what one of my midwives looks like in person. Like, there's an impersonal nature to it.
We have to assume that we're carrying the virus because so many people don't have any symptoms at all.
So we actually felt safer having, these few women come into our homes who had been self-quarantining themselves and just keeping us safe as best as we could. Whenever they would come here, the first thing before anyone touched anything was hand washing, up to their elbows and everything. So we just tried to keep things as clean as possible and preparing the birth environment to make sure it was clean. So we just tried to make sure that, we were Clorox wiping, the bathroom counters and the kitchen counter and the bar counter where all of the birth supplies would be especially. We didn't really do much physical contact at all before labor actually started. Your body was made to give birth, and your body was designed to birth your baby. So just to, really empower yourself, believe in your body's capabilities.
The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends women considering home births meet all of the following criteria. They have a low-risk pregnancy, have certified personnel who would attend the birth, and a pre-established network in case of transfer to a hospital. Ensure that the care of infants born at home be consistent with care in a medical facility. Arrange for 2 care providers to be present at each delivery.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.